Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Professor DPadget from Tennessee State University, and the topic is the politics and consequences of climate change. Dr. Padgett, even though you've talked about global warming and climate change, let's continue our discussion in reference to this and the impact that this is having on us as not only as a society, but financially what it means in reference to that, and why some folks are so opposed to it.
Okay, so right now, as far as climatology is concerned, we're in what we call climatology 2.0. Climatology 1.0 was where climatologists were trying to prove whether or not global warming was happening. Well, that's been proven as fact. However, those climatologists are physical scientists, and they really didn't speak to social scientists, didn't speak to economists, didn't speak to sociologists. But now the climatologists are looking at all the impacts of global warming and climate change and realize that in order to get policy developed to mitigate the impacts or to create some kind of ways of slowing this down, that science has to be translated into ways that economists, social scientists, political scientists can understand it. So now for the first time, we're starting to see climatologists talk to these social scientists. And so one of the issues is something that we call climate justice, because what we're seeing now is that climate change is going to affect everybody, but the lower income nations of the world that are growing most quickly in population, those are the places that are going to feel the effects the most. And so there's somewhat of an inequity and injustice in terms of the impacts of climate change upon people on the earth. And so the more powerful, wealthier countries are the ones that pollute the most and probably do more to increase the climate change and global warming, but it's the lesser wealthy nations that are going to feel the effects. So we need to get that point across from an economic standpoint. From a political standpoint, a lot of the less wealthy nations are more dependent upon natural resources. As natural resources such as water and of course food become more scarce and are impacted by drought and desertification, that may lead to conflict. So we're starting to see potentially a lot of wars may be fought over water, wars fought over food shortages, maybe wars fought over agricultural land and arable soil, which are all affected by global warming and climate change. So there's a political aspect in there also, in that environmental instability that's related to climate change can result in political instability and social instability, which when it comes to our government, now recognizing climate change as a national security issue, it's more along the lines of a global security issue, in that when we start to talk about wars being fought over resources and fossil fuels and oil, that's a national security issue. Anytime that something may cause our military to be involved somewhere on the planet in a conflict, that's a national security threat. Or obviously if there's a threat against the food resources of the world or water resources, that's going to eventually threaten national security. And so now we have, this being part of the lexicon and dialogue in the Senate and in our legislature, as far as it's not just being an issue of whether or not it's going to be too hot or too cold, but are we going to be able to defend ourselves or others in the event that the disparities caused by climate change result in conflict that may be resolved, unfortunately, via warfare. And so that's why this is a much greater threat. And that's why we need people outside of climatologists who understand global politics and economics to be involved. And so there's a lot of opportunity because, if a sociologist or historian or political scientist really wants to get involved in some really exciting research that will affect change, this is where it is, because climatologists themselves are often people who major in physics or physical geography. They don't have the training to communicate across political and social lines.
You know, one of the problems that I've heard in reference to this, and I'd like to raise this question and see if you might be able to give me an explanation in reference to it. This whole idea that out in the western parts of the United States that there's a real problem in terms of getting water in certain places, a drought all over it, et cetera. Now, I understand that according to some of the theories that California, Las Vegas, Nevada, and some of those areas are almost out of water. Now, what does that mean?
Well, drought cycles are not so much related to this issue of climate change. It's more of a localized issue in many cases. It's somewhat related to jet stream patterns. The whole El Nino, La Nina phenomenon that you've probably heard about, that has a significant effect upon climate. So climatology is a very complex field. It can't be explained away by short-term events. So for example, we had a very cold winter this winter. And so there are people who might say, oh, it's so cold this winter, that just shows you that climate change isn't happening. But that's just one season in 1 year. And so you can't make any pronouncements about what's happening anywhere over a short period of time with regard to this long-term global warming or climate change phenomenon. There are certainly fluctuations, but they're more related to things that are happening on the planet and the atmosphere that happen all the time, such as El Nino and La Nina. So we don't want to confuse these isolated droughts.
Local kinds of situations with.
And when I say local, the western portion of the United States is a small part of the world. Certainly it's bad, certainly it requires our attention, but to some degree, it does demonstrate some of what may happen. One of the things that's predicted to happen with climate change is we'll have more extreme fluctuations in local patterns, more extreme droughts, bigger hurricanes, huge unprecedented flood events such as what happened here in 2010. All of those are presumed to be part of climate change and global warming. But we can't say that, these are part of this longer term.
With this 1 year, that it means everything in terms of making some kind of evaluation that this is going to happen because of that. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, it might be somewhat of a symptom, but it's not a definition of the larger problem in and of itself.
Now, what would you, over the last 2 minutes that we have here, what would you advise most folks in terms of dealing with this idea of climate change and the politics of it or whatever? I mean, how should we react to that?
Well, there's a really good documentary that was produced here called Kilowatt Hours, which really talks about what individual citizens can do, even changing light bulbs or something little like that on an individual basis might not seem like a lot, but if everybody does it, you'd be amazed at how much we could save in terms of electricity, which means you burn less coal, which means there's less pollution. Now, one thing that's changed is the automobile industry has changed significantly in terms of bringing out these electric cars and producing cars that have greater mileage capacity and things like that. But being informed, really getting informed, the internet is a great source. Make sure that you're looking at sources that have legitimate pieces of information that are not biased one way or the other, because there are some places that'll tell you the world's coming to an end, global warming's happening, and there are other sources that are biased and on the other side saying, oh, nothing's happening, it doesn't have anything to do with humans. But somewhere in the middle is the truth, and that's what I would advise people to do. Get the real data, the real science on climate change and global warming, and then act accordingly. But we really have to prepare ourselves for the impacts, because whether it's human or natural, sea level rise is real. These things are going to happen.
And global warming, you say, is for real.
Absolutely.
That's one of the
there's no
things
debate
that you want to leave here, that there's nothing to debate about that, that
No.
the world is, the globe is warming up, and we ought to be aware of that. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, the question is it human or natural? That's the question.
Very good. And of course, let me thank you, and let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you, and good morning.